My objective this morning really was to provide an update and fill those in that maybe not completely familiar with kind of where we are with FDA strategy as it relates to specifically addressing the use of medically important antibiotics in food-producing animals. And I know a lot has been mentioned about it today, but primarily want to give kind of an update as to where we are and what the next steps are. So just covering clearly this really leads no further discussion about how complex this issue is, but also the fact that I think that clearly the theme I've heard, and really as evidenced by the nature of this meeting, it's really important every time or when we talk about this issue, we talk about it in the context of more of a holistic approach that really all uses of antibiotics are contributing to this issue. We need to look at it in that context, and really is why this is a good example of an issue that falls under the One Health umbrella. And the fact is clearly another challenge and reason why this issue has been so challenging is that there still continues to be gaps in the information we have and in the science. And that, of course, has made it even more challenging for us to understand how best to address the issue. But nonetheless, I think despite that, we do know enough about the issue to understand that there are some things that can be done to mitigate the risks, and we need to forge ahead with taking those steps, both in the interest of public and animal health. So clearly this has been an ongoing and debated issue for literally decades, and cuts across all sectors really of our society in terms of and really has been historically a debated issue ever since antibiotics first started to be used in animal agricultural settings. Ultimately, our goal really is to look at, to kind of cut through that and find ways that we can move forward in a productive way to be responsive to that public health concern, while at the same time making sure that we're paying attention to the fact that animal health needs need to be met as well. So with that in mind, I mean, there certainly has been a fair number of steps taken in the past targeting this concern of antibiotic use in food-producing animals. This sort of kind of gives you an indication of the fact that this has been an ongoing issue for literally decades, and we have continued to look for new steps to take. Even going back to the late 1980s probably was a sort of a turning point in which prior to that time most antibiotics that were coming in for FDA approval were still being made available as over-the-counter products. Really post late 1980s, essentially all new classes of antibiotics have really entered the marketplace, requiring veterinary oversight, either as prescription products or veterinary feed-directed products. And that was acknowledging the fact that we felt that because of the specific and unique concerns about resistance emergence in conjunction with the use of antibiotics, that it was important to have the expertise and oversight of a veterinarian involved in that process of using antibiotics. In 1996, we had the beginnings in the formation of the National Antimicrobial Resistance Monitoring System, which clearly is, and that's been mentioned a number of times before, that's a collaboration between agencies, FDA, USDA, and CDC. That's been an enormously important source of information, and that program has continued to grow since 1996. 1997, there was the, fluoroquinolones had fairly recently come into the marketplace and clearly identified as a critically important class of drug. And concerns were raised with regard to the use and extra-label use of those products, and the extra-label use was prohibited and for those fluoroquinolones as well as glycopeptides, again, because of concerns that such extra-label use could contribute to resistance. In 2003, which I think was also a significant thing for at least from FDA's perspective in terms of how we look at animal drugs and animal drugs that are coming in for approval, that we establish a very specific process for assessing antimicrobial resistance risks as a part of the new animal drug approval process. That had not systematically really been part of the approval process prior to that. Clearly, historically, the primary focus of attention as far as food safety concerns with the use of drugs, including antibiotics in food animals, were drug residues and resulting residues that may be present in the food. And really, beginning in the late 1990s and into early 2000s, really went through a public discussion process to kind of develop an approach for expanding that food safety assessment beyond residue assessment to look at the issue of resistance as well. So that, I think, is also a significant milestone. And really, all new antibiotics that are coming in now for approvals for use in food-producing animals include an assessment for risks that those uses may pose with regard to antibiotic resistance as it relates to the foodborne pathway of exposure. In 2005, the fluoroquinolone drug enrofloxacin was withdrawn from use in poultry. Certainly that has significant implications for the poultry industry, but again, that was an action that was taken because of public health concerns about the contribution of use of the fluoroquinolones in resistant Campylobacter and the potential and the public health consequences of that. And then it really brings us to 2010, where really is the beginnings of the effort we're in right now. And it's kind of surprising how quickly time flies. We're already 4 years into this. We started down this path in 2010 when we first came out and announced or published Guidance 209, which was this guidance relating to steps to ensure the judicious use of antibiotics in food animals, which was really the core of that was, and really the significance of this was really the first time FDA took a very clear position on saying that we really do not believe the use of medically important antibiotics, those that have human medical significance, using those particular antibiotics for production or growth promotion purposes is really a judicious use of those important products. So that, I think, also was a significant milestone for the agency to take that very clear position. And then in 2012, again, another critically important antibiotic classes are the cephalosporin, and additional action was taken in 2012 to limit certain extra-label uses of those classes, of that class of drugs in food-producing animal. Again, because of trying to mitigate concerns about antibiotic resistance risks. So, with all that, there's still, I think when you look back and look at the effort or the steps we put in place with looking at new antibiotics as part of the approval process in 2003, I think the gap that really remained was concerns about the older classes of products. As I mentioned earlier, really since the late 1980s, all the new classes of antibiotics that were coming into the marketplace and being approved really were coming in under veterinary oversight. But we did not retroactively go back and change all the older products that had been approved prior to 2003. Nor had all those older products necessarily gone through the new assessment process as it relates to assessing risks of antimicrobial resistance as part of the approval process. So really the crux of what we're doing now, the effort that really started with issuing Guidance 209 in 2010, the efforts that were going on now with the implementation strategy we've published with the follow-up Guidance 213 is really to focus on the look back, basically going back and looking at all those older products that were approved prior to 2003 and saying, what do we need to do to really bring those products up to really align with what our more current thinking is as to how antibiotics should or should not be used. And when we look, across that, I think the key elements, and that's why we honed in on these key elements, the key factors that were missing were the fact that, veterinary oversight was not in place for those products, and the fact that for the products or classes that fell into the category of being medically important, that those products were being used for growth promotion purposes, which we really didn't feel was in the overall interest of public health. So really then, as I mentioned, that the 2009 document, again, which we published as draft in 2010, I think was finalized in 2012, really honed in on these two principles. We need to limit the use of medically important drugs to really only those uses that are necessary for ensuring animal health. So that really means limiting their use to therapeutic uses when there's actual diseases that need to be managed in food-producing animals. And that's sort of a roundabout way of saying don't use them for growth promotion purposes, because growth promotion or production purposes are uses that are not directly tied to managing disease. And then secondly, of course, and really as importantly as that change is the need to make sure that all remaining uses of those drugs are then brought under veterinary oversight. And really the approach we set, or with initiating Guidance 209, was that our desire was to head down a path where we would engage stakeholders in a process for getting these changes in place. Clearly laying out the basic policy approach in guidance is, and I know this has been a source of some concern, is that it is a voluntary process by nature, in the sense that guidance is not legally binding. And so in that respect, it's seeking the cooperation of the key stakeholders to engage with FDA to get these changes made. So, again, the focus here is not to eliminate all antibiotics in use in food-producing animals, but to take steps to make sure they're being used as appropriately as possible. We know that animal disease needs to be addressed, and we need to have the tools available to address them. But we need to make sure that we're using these as wisely as possible. Ultimately, our goal is we need to preserve these antibiotics, not only for human health purposes, but there's obviously the interest of making sure these drugs continue to be effective for dealing with disease in animals as well. So when you look at sort of the components of this overall big picture, clearly, there's a couple of phases of this. I mean, one, we need to take the steps to get the changes we've identified implemented in a timeline and be able to stick to that timeline. So that's sort of, we need to implement the changes. We need to be able to communicate generally to the public, are we making progress, and what progress are we making in terms of getting those changes made. Third, once we've got those changes in place, do we have the mechanisms or metrics to be able to assess what the impacts are of those changes? Are we accomplishing what we set out to do? Are we affecting change in the way that we intended? And then fourth, I think, going even beyond that and supporting what we're doing, it really doesn't end there. I mean, clearly eliminating growth promotion uses and bringing these products under vet oversight are enormously important steps forward. They don't necessarily solve every issue and every concern about the use of antibiotics in animal agriculture, and more needs to be done. And I think a lot of which falls in this arena, which has been clearly a major subject of this meeting, is the issue of stewardship and what other steps do we need to do. Even focusing in on those remaining therapeutic uses that we intend to retain, are those remaining therapeutic uses really being used as judiciously as possible? And are there areas where improvements can be made? And I would suggest there certainly are. So those are things we need to continue working on. So as I sort of alluded to, the second guidance, which can be a bit confusing, there's two guidances, but again, the crux of it is the Guidance 213, which was implemented, finalized in December 2013, is really the implementation plan. And it kind of lays out, the basic approach of how we're going to get these changes made, those two key principles put in place. And one of the key elements of this Guidance 213 was it basically laid out the timeline, a 3-year timeline. And given that the document published in December 12th, 2013, 3 years gets us to December 12th, 2016. So that is the target. The target is to get these changes, meaning all affected products aligned to those two key recommendations by December of 2016. When you look across the inventory of all the products affected or all the approved new animal drug applications that are affected by this, there are about 7 classes of drugs. And just for clarity, what we are focusing on are those antibiotics that are used in feed or water that are medically important antibiotics. And once you identify that subset of products, all of which are currently available as over-the-counter, some component of those 283 products have growth promotion indications on them. Not all of them, but many of them do. Most of them that have growth promotion indications on them also have other therapeutic indications. So, and it is a very complex thing because we're talking about drug applications or drugs that have been approved over the past 40 plus years. There's individual single ingredient products, there's combination products, there's original pioneer products, there's generic products. There's a sort of tangled web of products that have to be sorted through to make sure that all the changes are made to align them with those recommendations. So the complete inventory of products or applications, we have a list up on our website. They're all listed there in terms of what those applications are. And there are 26 companies that are the holders of those applications. And we've directly contacted each and every one of those 26 companies. The good news is we've heard back from all 26 companies, and each of them have provided a written commitment to FDA that they fully intend to work with the agency to get these changes made to their products by the December 12th, 2016 deadline. That is extremely good news and a positive message as far as us moving forward. Clearly, there's still a lot of work to be done. We're already 1 year now, basically, almost into this, and we have 2 years to go, and there's a number of things that we need to get done leading up to that. One of which, an important element of which, is the Veterinary Feed Directive, or VFD. And the reason this is important is that many of the products that we're talking about are antibiotics used as a medicated feed. And the way the law is currently written, drugs, not just antibiotics, any animal drug that's used in a feed that requires veterinary oversight is designated or legally called a veterinary feed directive. It's not called a prescription drug. Even though it is effectively the corollary of a prescription, it has its own legal status called veterinary feed directive. There is a regulation in place that's been in place for since the early 2000s. That is essentially lays out the requirements that relate to people that are involved in the sale and distribution of drugs that are designated as VFD drugs. Historically, there's been a very limited number of products under the VFD process, and literally only a handful, 2 or 3 products that have been designated VFD, and so there's been a very limited set of products that have come under that system. So as you can imagine, thinking about that list of 283 products, we're making a very substantial change in terms of the landscape of products that is going to be handled under the Veterinary Feed Directive framework. That is why we have one of the key elements we've been working on is making sure that we kind of set the stage so that we can facilitate this transition of bringing all these products under veterinary oversight. So this is a critical piece of this. This rulemaking has been ongoing. We already issued a proposed rule. We've gotten comments on the proposed rule. We're working on finalizing that rule and have gotten a lot of input from a broad sector of stakeholders on this issue. We recognize there's a lot of practical implications, and we're doing the best we can to make this workable, but as well as sort of meeting the needs of making sure that it's a rigorous process. The intent is we want to make sure we get this process streamlined or updated and get the VFD regulation finalized within this 3-year window. And our target is the spring of 2015. And we hope to stick to that target to get the VFD rule in place. Again, as setting the stage for are setting the groundwork for all these products to start shifting, particularly as we hit the December 2016 timeline, because my expectation is that most of the changes are going to occur at the end of at that December 2016 timeline, and we need to make sure all these pieces are in place. So again, as far as the importance, clearly it's important that, and particularly based on my last comment, that most of the changes in terms of the product changes are going to occur at the end of the at the end of the 3-year timeline. So one, there really isn't an expectation that we're going to see any modification in terms of changes in patterns yet, because we haven't even implemented the changes. The changes are likely to be fairly weighted at the end on 2016. Given that, we need to be able to communicate to folks now, how are we doing, marching down that path towards December 2016. As I mentioned, we have a list of all the products up on the website now. We intend to provide periodic updates every 6 months. The last update was this past June. We're going to target another update in December and try to keep everyone up to date as much as we can as far as the progress we're making in terms of getting everything lined up so that we can actually get all these changes made. And obviously, key timeline then would be that our goal is we've gotten 100% of those changes. All affected products have been effectively aligned as appropriate by December 2016. And then really beyond 2016 really is where the assessment phase kicks in. And that's where a lot of the discussion we've had about what are the right metrics and having the right metrics in place, that's where that's going to become really important. Again, just touching on this, we've already touched on, which the thinking is here, we have some data available to us now. Our intent is that has value to us, that kind of information will be important. And as far as conducting, an overall assessment of how we're doing in terms of progress in the changes we're making, but that we also need some additional information, particularly as it relates to on-farm use and resistance. And that's another key objective in terms of the work we need to do between now and December 2016, particularly thinking about the idea that it certainly would be helpful to have some baseline data in hand as we move forward beyond 2016. So timing is going to be an issue, and so there's certainly work to be done there, and we expect to be getting more public input on that process in the near future. Again, and then just back to this idea of reinforcing stewardship. I think in the timeline, there's a number of key things. I think the window of time between spring 2015, when we finalized the VFD regulation, I think the key element is there's going to clearly be a need for training, outreach, education, particularly as it relates just to the logistics of implementing the new VFD process, the process of having veterinary oversight of these products. And our view would be that window of time between the spring of 2015 and December 2016 that's going to be an important window to make sure we get the necessary training education out to all the different folks that are involved in that process to make sure that we get them up to speed in terms of the new changes that were put into effect with regard to the VFD process, leading up to all the products being switched over to veterinary oversight. And then, really even going beyond that, and I mentioned that these changes are not the end of the story. There's more work to be done. Certainly, again, focusing on the remaining therapeutic uses, we need to make sure those uses are being used as judiciously as possible, particularly looking at certain areas where antibiotics are used for prevention purposes. We need to make sure that those prevention uses are really appropriate and necessary, and if we can find ways to look at ways we can reduce reliance on prevention use of antibiotics, I think that's an area where we need to be focusing attention, and certainly we're going to be looking to our USDA partners on that issue in terms of looking at alternatives and research that's needed to help support those kinds of efforts. Again, I think as far as the overall collaborative approach we've tried to take with this, I think we're very encouraged by the engagement we've gotten from the industry on working together on finding a way forward on this. We hope to really build on this, particularly as we kind of move into some of the other supporting activities that we need to do to make this work including developing, the needed data collection and on-farm use information that I think overall benefits us all in terms of being able to articulate how we're doing in terms of these kinds of efforts and stewardship efforts. So we certainly look to further that collaboration with all the stakeholders, as well as the additional work that needs to be done with regard to antibiotic stewardship efforts. Our view is that those kinds of approaches are going to be much more effective if we have everyone at the table working in the same direction. So just in summary, I think we've got a lot of work to do. I think we're moving down this pathway in a very positive way. And we obviously, I think, are making a good progress in setting the stage for getting all these changes implemented. Our goal is to finalize the VFD rule in the spring. We're going to continue to work to provide periodic updates to the public to keep everyone apprised of how we're doing, kind of moving towards that 2016 goal. There's going to need to be concurrently ongoing work to make sure we develop the necessary data and metrics to be able to ensure we can effectively assess how we're doing over time. And I think that's something we're going to have to continue to work on. And then lastly, but very importantly, is continuing to work on the issue of stewardship, particularly to support, where we go from here forward in terms of making sure that we can effectively implement these changes and bring about meaningful veterinary oversight of these products and make sure that all remaining therapeutic uses are as appropriate as possible.